So good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks to everybody online for bearing with us and waiting 72 hours for Nefeli's talk. I'm so sorry that we had to postpone Nefeli's talk until today. And actually, if you know, we were gutted that we couldn't have Nefeli last Monday. So I'm delighted that we're able to have her tonight, and that loads of people have come tonight as well, and lots of people are online as well. Nefeli has suggested, and I think it'd be a very good thing to do if we have a minute's silence to start with, to remember the lives that have been lost in Turkey and Syria. Thank you, everyone. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker to you. Not only is she giving a Roman paper, which of course is the best period of any period you can work on, of course, but really selfishly, and don't tell any of my other students, Nefeli was one of my very favorite students. I taught Nefeli as an undergraduate, and I love that she's carried on to do Greek archaeology. She was an exceptional student as an undergraduate and has been an exceptional PhD student as well. She has become a fabulously accomplished academic, and look at her, she's only little still. It's also fabulous that she's kept in touch too. She's published on the Cyclades, and her stellar work on Epirus, and not just on Epirus, but on agriculture in Epirus, agriculture in a period that is not terribly really well known, particularly in that part of Greece, has been critical in filling in gaps and answering really difficult questions. And the work that she's done, which I can testify to, has been immense. She went and visited huge numbers of sites. She plowed through vast quantities of pottery and material. She sought after archives. She did thorough, excellent work. And it gives me a huge pleasure now to introduce Nefeli to you. And she's going to be talking to us tonight on a topic. The title of her paper is In Search of Greek and Roman Agricultural Economies in Epirus in the Early Imperial Period. Thank you very much, Nefeli.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and to all of the BSA staff, all of you for being here, and of course the online audience as well. I don't know if I can quite see who is on there. I guess you can't, but yeah, thank you. Amazing. Thank you all so much for showing up. I hope you can all see me okay, and I hope I'm not going to have trouble with this mouse. Perfect. Let's bring that down. Great. So today I'm going to talk about ancient agriculture. The overwhelming majority of people in ancient societies lived in the countryside. Their livelihood depended in large part on the husbandry of crops and animals, which shaped their lifestyles, how and where people chose to live, their relationships with others, and the organization of their communities. Yet less has been told about ancient societies from the perspective of people that lived in the countryside compared to the many works devoted to city dwellers. In this talk, I investigate different forms of rural settlement to explore agricultural economies in Epirus in Northwest Greece during the early imperial period. This is work that was part of my doctoral thesis, as Rebecca mentioned, completed at Oxford, which investigated the transformation of the agricultural economy over a longer span from the 2nd century before Christ to the 4th century after Christ. For my thesis, I used much primary data, access to which was granted by efforts of antiquities in Epirus, to whom I am incredibly grateful. My end goal in this research, in my thesis and in this talk, is to investigate change and continuity during the Roman period in communities in Epirus from a rural perspective by reconstructing agricultural change, and to explore to what extent it's possible through such a study to distinguish between economies broadly characterized as Greek or as Roman, and more importantly, to understand differences and similarities between rural site types and economies at different times. So what do I mean by Greek and Roman agriculture? Well, that's not an easy distinction, hence my talk. In the Roman period, agricultural economies have been understood in the context of the Roman economy, which scholars like Peter Temin and Alan Bowman, together with Andrew Wilson, argued was an integrated market economy involving large-scale trade and reliant on agricultural specialization and intensification, in part through large estates called villas. By contrast, the economies of the classical and Hellenistic periods, broadly understood as Greek, have been seen as less connected and smaller scale, the size of estates being smaller. So, for example, in classical Athens, according to Ian Morris, property sizes were limited by the concept of equal wealth distribution, which has been associated with the idea of Athenian democracy. But while the scale of agricultural activity and agricultural production clearly increased in the Roman period, the idea that there was a simple division between less and more complex economic models in pre-Roman versus Roman times has been slowly crumbling. Researchers like Asdem Izdebski and his colleagues have argued using pollen data for integrated market economies and a considerable trade expansion in archaic and classical times in parts of Greece. Evidence for large estates not unlike villas, like fortified farms, shown in my introductory slide, has also increasingly come to the fore through the work of Sarah Morris and John Papadopoulos, Anna Blomley at Oxford, and Sylviane Fichard, amongst others. But the extent to which and how fortified farms differed from villas is something that has seen a lot less study in Greece. There's a big exception to that. The monumental volume, Ville Rusticae, farms, family and market-oriented farms in Greece under Roman rule. It is literally huge, if you've seen it. Published by Ioannis Touratsoglu and Athanasios Rizakis. This was the first volume to set out to explore the villa in a Greek setting. And it was an important stepping stone as part of broader research at the National Hellenic Research Foundation on agricultural economies in Greece, especially during the Roman period. That research ranged from issues of land ownership and the relationship of local elites with Rome to the study of villas. This and other work prompted research on how the economies of parts of Greece in pre-Roman times differed from those of Roman times, at what rate they might have changed, and when. So, intrigued by these questions, I set out to accumulate data for different rural sites, specifically richer excavated rather than surveyed data, to consider whether based on different forms of rural settlement used at different times, we can trace changes in economies in an area of Greece, focusing on Epirus, as this area became incorporated into the Roman world. The question of how fortified farms, though, traditionally linked with pre-Roman period economies related to villas, traditionally connected to Roman period economies, is at the crux of my talk, though I suspect we're going to come up with more questions and answers. So what is a villa? It's a type of rural settlement found across the Roman Empire in all shapes and sizes. From the grand to the seemingly unimpressive. Some examples found almost complete, others only partial. Given this diversity in the archaeological record, how do we define the villa? Well, villas were first and foremost farms with facilities for efficient processing of lucrative crops like oileries, wineries, and fisheries. These were most often indicative of market-oriented agricultural production. Villas also had elite living spaces like grand reception areas and terraces from which to enjoy impressive views of the landscape. This is the traditional definition given for villas in Italy by scholars like Annalisa Marzano. For my purposes, I define villas more specifically, also by decoration and architecture indicative of social practices and design aesthetics adopted widely by members of the elite of the Roman Empire. So for example, rooms with wall paintings that could be used in staged dining, outward-looking landscape architecture like porticos, and communal baths. And these are features that, as we're going to see, help to distinguish the villa from fortified farms. Turning to Epirus, our star this evening. This is an area that in antiquity extended from modern-day Greece. I hope you can all see my mouse here. To southwestern Albania up here. Oh, no. We're going to center on two regions today, and those are coastal Chaonia, which is right here, and central Thesprotia. And specifically in coastal Chaonia, the plains to the north, east, and south of Lake Butrint. And in Thesprotia, the Kokitos and Acheron valleys, which are right here. The temporal focus is the early imperial period, which I understand is ranging from the late 1st century BCE, approximately the last quarter, to the 2nd or 3rd quarters of the 1st century after Christ. But we're going to look at a broader temporal context. I'd like you to think of country houses not as static, but as dynamic, considering rural site trajectories, and especially the forms of rural sites in earlier periods to understand how they changed in the early imperial period. To analyze this topic, we're going to look at archaeological and topographic data, so architecture, landscape organization, ceramics, and agricultural installations. The early imperial period was one when agricultural economies in Epirus experienced considerable change, which is why I've chosen to focus on it today. Whether we can interpret that as change from Greek to Roman agriculture is a question I'm going to come back to at the end of this talk. Villas emerged in the early imperial period in Epirus. But based on work conducted for my thesis, I don't believe this was a time when villas were widespread. As you can see from this graph, plotting villa sites over time with dark gray representing definite evidence for habitation, light gray possible habitation. It was originally thought that villas flourished from early Roman times onwards, as early as the mid-2nd century BCE, if we count sites, these first 6 sites here, called fortified villas. However, my fieldwork and study of ceramics from certain key sites, showed that most villas peaked in the middle and later imperial periods. I'm not going to go into this data here now because a lot of it has to do with later periods. But the important thing is that in early imperial times, the villa was one emergent, but not the only, or even the typical way of managing agricultural resources in Epirus. Other forms were in certain regions much more popular. In coastal Chaonia, fortified rural structures, which I'm going to go into in a minute, were constructed in Hellenistic times, and they saw new architectural phases in Roman times. This was a landscape of expansive alluvial plains, according to environmental research, and it still is, as you can see from these pictures, and of low hills, therefore very well suited to agricultural diversity. In the plains, grains and legumes like wheat, oats, barley, and beans could be cultivated. Animals like cattle and sheep could graze on them and on higher levels, and olives and vines could be cultivated on the hillsides. Agricultural diversity and productivity is also suggested by ancient written sources. Caesar described how he relied on Epirus to supply his army in 49 to 48 BCE, while awaiting a clash with Pompey to the north in Dyrrhachium. He sent 2 of his legates to procure provisions, frumentarie, or more specifically grain, depending on how you interpret the Latin, from Epirus, using Butrint in coastal Chaonia as one of his bases of operations, establishing grain depots, chorea, and assigning local communities the responsibility for transport. He also wrote that when all of the grain crops, frumentis, far and wide had been consumed, he fed his soldiers with barley, hordeum, pulses, legumina, and herd animals, pecus, of which there was a large supply in Epirus. Epirot animal stock was immortalized by Varro in the second book of his De Re Rustice, which takes the form of a dialogue set in 67 BCE between 5 Italian landowners who were known as the Sine Epirote. One of them was Titus Pomponius Atticus, a confidant of Cicero. Atticus was also based at Butrint in coastal Chaonia. Now, fortified rural structures, variably interpreted as military sites, temples, or villas, quote unquote villas, were built in this landscape. They were built in the Hellenistic period or even earlier, and they were remodeled in the Roman period. I'm going to discuss their layouts in Hellenistic times first before turning to the Roman remodeling. They were located in elevated, steep, and not easily accessible locations, as I and those that I convinced to join me on fieldwork discovered. They were constructed using large stone blocks, most often ashlar masonry. Many were identified through survey, but 6 were studied in more detail and excavated by Dimiter Chondi, who is an absolute legend of Albanian archaeology. I'm going to focus on these 6 examples, which were located at Mala Freya, which is pictured here, Čukajtojt, Čuka, Metok, Dobra, and another less well-preserved example at Matomara. Despite dissimilar preservation and research histories, a similar architectural design can be observed between them. For example, the structures at Čuka, like those at Metok and Dobra, all consisted of an enclosure of roughly similar surface area, approximately 900 to 1,000 meters squared, forming a courtyard, which had a tower in the center, as well as suites of rooms lining one or more of the inner sides of the enclosure. Returning to the structure at Malathrea, that also had a courtyard, at least 2 or possibly 4 towers that you can see here. And after its Roman remodeling, according to Chondi, the excavator, saw the addition of suites of rooms here, here, and here. At the site of Matomara, no tower was noted, nor any stone-built remains beyond these 2 rooms over here. But it is possible that these were not preserved following very intense agricultural activity in the 1980s. The general plan of these fortified structures consisted of a courtyard or enclosure, circa 1 kilometers squared, often incorporated fortifications like 1 or more towers, as well as the suites of rooms alongside one or more of the sides of the enclosure. And this is a design that recalls the plan of fortified farms elsewhere, for example, in Macedonia, like at Triaplatania and at Komboloi. At those sites, much evidence for the storage and processing of agricultural produce was found, especially in suites of rooms, while courtyards were interpreted as multifunctional areas to facilitate agricultural activities. I believe this might actually have been a more general plan that was also employed for fortified farms in Epirus. Evidence for agricultural activities and for the storage of goods is very well reflected. Carbonized cereal seeds were found at Metop, which is pictured here, or hopper rubber mills at Malathrea, probably also at Metop. I'm not sure about this because I'm not sure about how to interpret the meaning of gyre mokre. I think it means millstones in Albanian, but if anyone is a good Albanian speaker, that would be very helpful. But the best evidence for agricultural production is the extensive storage capacity afforded by the design of these structures in the suites of rooms and in the towers. In the rooms alongside the interior of the northern and southern enclosures, at Metok, numerous pithoi, large storage vessels, were found in situ. Fragments of massive pithoi and amphorae were also found at Matomara, Malathrea, Chuka, Metok, and Dobra. They were found in place in the suites of rooms at Chuka and in the eastern side of the courtyard at Malathrea. Storage rooms at Metok and Chuka were paved, possibly to create raised platforms upon which to store foodstuffs and keep them dry and out of reach of pests. The upper stories of towers, which were reached by stairways preserved at Chuka that you can see here, could also have served well to keep pests at bay and provided more adequate ventilation, helping to maintain cooler temperatures and preserve dry goods. This is exactly what Columella, the Latin agronomist, advises for the storage of grains, to keep them in lofts reached by ladders rather than on the ground floor for adequate ventilation and to avoid humidity. These fortified structures that I've explored here, therefore, can be interpreted as farms, this being at least one of their functions, with goods stored in the suites of rooms around the courtyards that were activity areas. Fortifications were another important design feature, and they might have been built to allow for the defense of produce and refuge of resident farmers and nearby workers from marauders, if need be, as Anna Blomley argued for certain agricultural towers in the Argolid. Towers could also have served as symbols of wealth and social status for their owners. While fortified farms have been interpreted as villas, this interpretation corresponds to their function as large farms, but I believe the peculiarities that I've pointed out, pertaining specifically to fortified structures and not necessarily to villas, based on my definition of them, mean that fortified farms are better understood as a different type of rural settlement. In the Roman period, these sites underwent remodeling, sometimes following the collapse of certain spaces, as seems to have happened in Malathrea, which is shown here. Phase 1 is the shaded part of the plan and corresponds to the original design. And phase 2, the white unshaded part of the plan, corresponds to its architectural layout in Roman times, following the collapse, according to Chondi, of 2 postulated towers, Tower 4 here and Tower 3 here. The construction of new rooms at different structures, like at Malathrea, Chuka, or Dobra, didn't need to be contemporary, but the dating of Roman habitation phases, which started from the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, or more often from the 1st century CE to the 3rd or 4th centuries, suggests that these new architectural phases came in the early Roman period. These are broad chronologies and reliant on date ranges of finds unearthed by rescue archaeology, which didn't reveal very much about the stratigraphy of these sites. So the date ranges are better taken as provisional and don't necessarily reflect the accurate chronology of a site. It's not possible using this kind of evidence to ascribe precise start dates, but it is possible to highlight periods in which these structures flourished based on material fine concentrations, much like in survey work. In the case of Malathrea, for example, a large quantity of ceramic material dated to the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE. Some finds were definitively of the 1st century after Christ, like a cooking pot, which I hope the online audience could see. It's pretty visible here, but not as much on the computer. It's on the left of this illustration, and it's an early Roman cooking pot 2 of the mid 1st century CE. And this is corresponding to Paul Reynolds' Epirus cooking pot series. Other finds were possibly Augustan, like this almost completely flat plate shown on the right, resembling the almost flat body of the vassoi carenati produced at Phoiniki, a city in coastal Ionia, between the 1st century BCE and the first decades of the 1st century after Christ, and especially in the Augustan period. No finds definitively predated early imperial times, which is why I'd suggest that this structure was enlarged and new rooms were constructed in the Augustan period or close to it, because this is when the farmers at Malathrea thrived. The expansion of the structure, which according to Chondi involved the constructions of rooms B and E to the west, F, C, I, and H to the north, K, D, and G to the east, was interpreted as a transformation of the complex into a villa because of the postulated loss of the 2 towers here and here. Clearly having some issues here with the mouse. I apologize. I don't believe that the structure lost its fortified character, since the southern towers, Tower 1 and Tower 2, right here, there it goes again, were not torn down, nor were the towers of other fortified structures like Chuka and Metok. Actually, at Malathrea, the 2 towers now framed the new southern entrance to the site, right here, which overlooked the Vrina plain. Go away. Which overlooked the Vrina plain, and would actually have made these even more visible to passerbys in the Roman period. Instead, I'd say that the expansion of this structure actually maintained it as a fortified farm and added to its storage capacity with rooms D and G, yes, fantastic, that Chondi interpreted as storage rooms, and room B right here, a long room approximately 181 meters squared with 4 central pillars, which could have supported a tall roof, whose layout resembles that of chorea or storage depots elsewhere. New rooms constructed inside the enclosures at Chuka and Dobra, as well as Metok, also increased the storage capacity of those farms, which arguably corresponded to larger estates and to agricultural intensification in the Roman period. Moving on to the second region we're looking at today, central Thesprotia. The valleys of the Kokitos and Acheron rivers were home to different rural site types in the Hellenistic period. Dispersed villages dotted the lowlands of the Kokitos Valley, which were used immediately after the conquest, or continued to be used immediately after the conquest, but were not used into the early imperial period. Higher up along the slopes of mountains, fortresses like one at Ayos Donatos occupied elevated locations with commanding views. These sites were identified through survey by the Finnish team of the Thesprotia expedition, working in close collaboration with the Ephorate of Antiquities of Thesprotia. These sites were investigated through test trenches and survey. The test trenches revealed important changes to the spatial organization of rural sites, like that at Ayos Donatos. Its principal investigator, Bjorn Forsen, argued these these spatial reorganizations transform the fortress into a villa. And I'm going to return to that idea shortly. First, we're going to have a quick look at this landscape. Rivers traverse these valleys, namely the Acheron River, which according to geological cores taken by Besson, Rapp, and Jing, flowed in antiquity to the north of Castries, right here, instead of to the south, which means that the Acheron River actually took the course of the Cocytus River in antiquity. The modern day Cocytus flows this way. This very well irrigated landscape would have facilitated the cultivation of legumes like fava beans, which were discovered in super abundant quantities, stored alongside smaller amounts of cereals in at least 43 pithoi in the fortified complex at the Necromandion in the southwest of the Acheron Valley, right here. Riverine environments and marshes would also have been suitable winter pastures for livestock like sheep and cattle, pigs and goats, bones of which were found alongside those of wild game like deer in the Cocytus Valley, the modern day Cocytus Valley right here. The export of foodstuffs would have been made easy in ancient times by the far larger size than in the present of the well-sheltered Gulf of the Rlicis Limen, called Rlicis Limen by Cassius Dio, or stop playing with me. You're brilliant, thank you. This is much better. So the sweet-watered harbor, because of the rivers that flowed into it in antiquity. This was a much, much larger harbor than it is in the present, as you can see here, where most of these areas today are marshes, which sheltered the entirety of Octavian's fleet just before he sailed south to meet the fleets of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. It may have been the abilities to get goods out afforded by this very large harbor that agricultural growth relied on in antiquity, which attracted Roman investors and contributed to significant changes to the agricultural economy of the region. Aios Donatos. This was a fortress that saw considerable investment in early Roman times and changes that turned it into a villa. While only parts of the site have been excavated through test trenches, we are very well informed about the chronology because key areas have been systematically excavated and ceramics studied in their stratigraphic context by Paul Reynolds, as well as by Yannick Gahemo, and I'm very sorry if I'm mispronouncing this name. Already by the middle of the 1st century BCE, before Christ, new rooms had been constructed in Trench D, over here. Thank you, Yorgo, with wall paintings in the second Pompeian style. Such compositions, which have been studied by Agneta Freccero with illusionary monochrome painted panels, painted pilasters, painted marble, as well as architecture in stucco, were popular in central Italy around the first half of the 1st century before Christ. At Aios Donatos, they might have been chosen to decorate the walls of a dining or reception room sometime between the deposition of cleanup in the 2nd quarter of the 1st century before Christ of material that had previously collapsed and the construction of a new pavement in the tower of the fortifications right here in the middle of the 1st century BCE. So between the 2nd quarter and middle of the 1st century BCE, the wall paintings were made. Together with the construction of cisterns in trenches G and H over here, and access to fresh water supplied by a 1 kilometer long pipeline, which might point to the existence of a yet undiscovered bath suit. The design of elaborate spaces to receive guests, modeled on rooms found in contemporary Italian villas, modeled on Italian social practices, define the complex as a villa. The villa flourished in the early imperial period based on the large quantities of material dating from the late 1st century BCE to the late 1st century after Christ, found in a considerable dump of household artifacts deposited around the 3rd quarter of the 1st century CE in the tower right here. These artifacts included regional as well as imported tablewares. With Italian terra sigillata imports exploding from the middle of the 1st century after Christ, according to Reynolds, and gobsmackingly almost reaching the amounts in the form of Bertrand. The early imperial contexts in the tower also had evidence for local production using clay resources of bricks, primarily with Latin stamps, as well as of amphorae, both of which are products typically associated with villa economies. According to Reynolds, these were local or regional products based on the similar composition of their fabrics to the naked eye, with that of other locally produced ceramic vessels like pithoi, found in other smaller farms in the Cocytus Valley, for example, the farm at Uriza. The amphorae, which had a distinctive shape that Reynolds calls medium-sized Epirus amphorae, these are them, with flat, freestanding domed bases, which might have contained local products like the cereals and legumes produced in the valley, and which may have been exported. Olives or olive oil are other possibilities because they're known to have been produced in Elea, which is a city also in the Cocytus Valley, just before the Roman period, though chronologies there are a little bit shaky. The bricks that you can see here on the left bore the stamps COS and PHML, which could correspond to the abbreviated name of a private brick producer, officinator, or the villa's owner, a dominus, or the owner of clay resources. In any of these scenarios, they connect local production to the family of the Cosini, an Italian business-oriented family widely active in the Eastern Mediterranean, whom Fersen prefers to see as the owners of the villa, since Lucius Cosinius specifically is mentioned by Varro as one of the Synepirote in the 2nd book of the Dere Rusticae. Chewy, the dog of the BSA, doesn't agree with that. We might have to revisit the interpretation. Lucius Cosinius was one of the Synepirote, or Italian landowners with flocks in Epirus. Now, bricks bearing the COS and PHML stamps, as well as other stamps like P.CUR and P.CURT, P-Curt, were also found at the complex of the Necromandion in the Acheron Valley to the south. This was a massive fortified complex with an enclosure constructed of polygonal masonry, resembling Cyclopean walls, and in antiquity it towered over the river delta that exited into the Glikis Limen. In this case, the P-Cur and P-Curt stamps were also reproduced on amphorae, indicating more definitively the local production of both. They might have been manufactured in 2 pottery kilns found just to the north of the Necromandion. It's possible the stamps refer specifically to the Curti, another well-connected Italian family which grew vines and traded wine out of Kos, and who appear to also have had land in Epirus, from which they may have exported local products in amphorae stamped with their name. What's interesting about these finds from the Necromandion is that this site can hardly be described as a villa. While it's been reinterpreted as a religious site and associated with chthonic cultic practices, it may also have been a fortified farm, according to Dietwulf Batz and Wiseman, who pointed to considerable quantities of goods stored in different rooms, for example, in the tower, in room M, which were very well preserved after the tower's collapse after fire. This second interpretation was also seconded by Fersen, and it's possible that the site doubled as a farm and a site of religious significance, or that its function changed over time. In any case, though, it's a rural site type, which is definitely not a villa, but which seems to have been associated in the Roman period with individuals belonging to a family of Roman negotiatores. So where does that leave us in terms of fortified farms and villas? In two different regions in Epirus, we've seen that two different rural site types were popular in the early imperial period. One is the fortified farm, the other is the villa. The first has traditionally been connected to Greek economies of the classical and Hellenistic periods, and the second with quote unquote Roman economies of the Roman period. These were two different types of country houses. And while they've been associated with so-called Greek or Roman agriculture, both of them are used in the early imperial period in Epirus. Fortified farms had courtyards, which could facilitate farm activities. They had storage rooms, often in suites of rooms around those courtyards. They had fortifications, which could provide defense in case of looters or showcase the status of their owners. Villas, on the other hand, had elite living quarters, like elegant rooms to receive guests with colorful wall paintings. They had facilities like oileries and wineries to process large quantities of certain products to be sold in near and faraway markets. No such installations were found at the Villa Arrayos Donatos, but since only small parts of this site have been explored through test trenches, it's possible that they haven't yet been discovered. And generally, processing facilities are frequently found as part of villas in Epirus, for example, at the Villa of Strongili in the area of the Imbratian Gulf. Arrayos Donatos, though, the medium-sized locally produced amphorae with flat bases, indicate the storage, presumably of local goods, which could have been consumed in Epirus or exported. So both fortified farms and villas seem to have produced goods often for the market. Is that the case? This is something that's generally well accepted as part of the villa's definition, with examples of large-scale productions. For example, wine from Italy, produced in villas, but also in other types of rural sites like smaller farms and villages, traversing the Alps to be exchanged for slaves in Gaul. But it is something that hasn't quite stuck to the definition of the fortified farm. In my opinion, the sheer size of these farms, their extensive storage areas, finds of agricultural equipment, their considerable defenses, and their large courtyards, indicative of a bustling farm life, point to the role of these farms also as market-oriented agricultural producers. In fact, there's such an emphasis on practicality in the layout of these farms, with barely any evidence of space being left over for elite social activities that even if elites resided in them, which contrasts with the layout of villas. Massive amphorae were also found at fortified farms in the Roman period. For example, at Malathrea, at Chouka Itoit, Chouka, and Metok. Based on their shapes, for example, Lambolia II, they were presumed to be of Italic and especially Adriatic origin, because that's where Lambolia II amphorae are produced or are known to be produced. In that case, they might have been imports, which makes them indicative of the exchange of substantial goods for them. Another possibility is that they contained local products and that they were locally made, modeled upon the amphora shapes that were especially common and sought after in this part of the Mediterranean, and especially in the early Roman period, like Lambolia II amphorae. And until ceramic analyses are carried out, we can't know if these are imports or local products modeled on imports. Therefore, country houses like fortified farms had a similar economic function to villas. both being market-oriented. Fortified farms had been in use before the Roman period in Hellenistic times in Epirus. They continued to be used during the Roman period. Villas were primarily used in the Roman period, but in Italy, they also had earlier forms during the late Republic. So while there's a clear difference in the features that characterized fortified farms from villas, which make them different rural sites, their use was not restrained by a particular time period. They could be contemporary, and economically, they served not dissimilar purposes. So, can we distinguish between Greek and Roman agriculture, and should we try based on this? Not all of us might agree. In the same way that we can't make simple distinctions between so-called Greek and Roman people, because the meaning of Greek or Roman is not the same for me as it is for any one of you. We also can't unambiguously distinguish between a Greek and a Roman agriculture. But it's difficult to make this distinction, not only because of the ambiguity in meanings, but because we find similar processes at play and similar structures at different times. And that means it's actually not possible to construct a development from one to another model of agriculture, and definitely not paint a straightforward picture from less to increasing economic complexity. But in seeking out the differences in agricultural practices, it's possible to identify agricultural change, periods in which different forms of rural settlement flourished. And that's important. Why is it important? Because it can be reflective of wider change in local communities and societies, change that can also be investigated in different aspects of life, like religion, technology, crafts, architecture. In Epirus, villas were not nearly as widespread in early Roman times as they were in other regions of the Roman world that were conquered early on, despite the proximity of the region to Italy. Instead, farms that had been in use before the Roman period, like the fortified farm you see here, continued to be used, while villas also more slowly emerged. The plot thickens. Different types of rural sites could be used also by different people. In fact, fortified farms might even have been used over villas by Italian landowners active in Epirus, as we learn from a letter of Cicero to his friend Atticus, one of the Synepirote. In 58 before Christ, Cicero wrote to Atticus to thank him for the offer to stay at his place, apud te in Epiro, during his exile from Italy, being deeply touched by his friend's offer. And he proceeded to refer to this as a remote castellum munitum, perhaps remote because of its rural setting, which means that Atticus may have owned a fortified farm. Thank you all very much. And a big thank you to all the institutions in the UK and Greece that helped with all of this research, but also to all the people who helped on fieldwork and more broadly, and especially the Gasus Epirotes. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Ellie, thank you so much. Yeah, that's yours. Thank you so much. That's a huge thanks to Nefelli for such a wide-ranging paper, and she's really done extremely well to marshal such a huge range of data and so generously sharing it with us too. I'm particularly struck, of course, by the way you can associate individuals with those homesteads, or hopefully you can associate the individuals with the homesteads. I didn't really want it to end, but I'm sure we have lots of questions in the audience, and I'd like to invite any questions. And I know that there are some online questions as well, but let's have somebody in the audience first. Any questions? Heinrich.
I'm sorry, this is probably a really annoying question to ask.
That's because you're a Bronze Age archaeologist.
Yes.
Sorry, even worse.
You were referring to fava beans in Thesprotia.
Oh, yeah.
Simple question. There's 3 different plants that are called fava. Which one is it?
That's a very good question, Heinrich. I assume broad beans and fava beans are the same thing to you?
Yes.
I don't know. But there's an excellent article by a woman. Her last name is Razoya, who has done archaeobotanical analysis on the finds from the Necromandean, as well as from a farm in Ioannina to the east, and you can definitely find which types they are there, and her work is really great as well.
Okay, thank you, and sorry for the.
I'm disturbed by Nefeli saying, I assume fava beans and broad beans are the same thing.
I think they are, yeah.
What?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
That's a type of broad bean. In Greece, mostly fava is made of yellow strip beans,
Yeah.
except in Santorini where it's a veg.
Wow.
The things you find out during an agriculture talk.
I know, I don't know. I have a question, Nefeli. So in your, I mean, you talked about how obviously various people could have used the different types of fortified farms or villas, but do you, in your fieldwork, have you come across any kind of spatial distribution depending on land type that you could say is helping to dictate why they are located where they are?
So this is in terms of different locations for different rural site types. Fortified farms tend to be in much steeper locations. Villas are much more nestled into the landscape than fortified farms. And I think that, you know, it connects to the whole definition of a villa as something which is connected to the landscape and makes use of it and has porticos going in and out of it. The landscape itself is going in and out of the villa in different ways. So that, I think that's probably the main distinction. So, you know, you would probably find a fortified farm on top of a hill, and a villa just on the foothills of that hill. But in terms of, if you're asking about different regions, or no, the landscape.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience? Vanessa.
It is a fascinating subject, really very complex. There are many questions. One question is,
it's a good thing we have dinner.
Between villas and cities or villages. Did you find village urbane nearby the cities as the major cities? And with this connection family between the production and the cities.
That's a really excellent question. I didn't go into this so much in this talk because, interestingly enough, it doesn't seem to have as much relevance for the early imperial period in Epirus, despite this being a time when colonies are founded. Villas are very often founded near cities, especially new cities, so cities that are built in the Roman period. So, for example, we find them near Butrint in coastal Ioannina, but really very close to Butrint, not further away. So they're, you could say a very far stone's throw across the Vivari Channel, but for example, the Aporit and the villa on the Vrina Plain. We also find a lot of them near Nicopolis, but to the south in the Ambracian Gulf. But they don't start out as huge villas. A lot of these sites start out as farms, especially in the area of Nicopolis. And they really only turn into villas quite clearly later on towards the end of the imperial period, with the exception of the Aporit near Butrint. And of course, there are some exceptions. Agios is very interesting because Elea, the city, which is very close to it, that was used in the Hellenistic period, has supposedly stopped functioning at this time. Maybe. Fortified, which is a colony, is also founded in this area. And Agios could to some extent be connected to it, but it definitely starts out before the foundation of the colony. And it's very rich very early on, so it would be surprising, I think, for it to only have that connection to the colony. Yeah, does that answer your question? Is that... Yeah, the cat is right here.
It's like a zoo. Are there online questions?
Yes,
I think Alex had a question as well. Or...
Shall we go for an online one and then go back to Alex? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, yes. A similar question for two participants that are wondering about workers and if there's any evidence of them living in those structures, and if not, where would they possibly be located?
Can you just give a summary of the question so that people online can hear?
Of course. The question was if there's evidence of people living in the structures, and if not, where would they be living?
Workers.
Workers.
Yes.
Oh, workers. Oh, interesting. Are we talking about the fortified structures specifically, or villas?
Yes, the fortified structures.
Okay. Well, there's definitely evidence of people living there in the form of tablewares and fine tablewares. You might not necessarily connect that to workers, just more to the residents of these structures. I think that they could easily have lived in these structures, but what's interesting is that there's definitely far less evidence for luxury spaces. There is evidence for living, for household life, and we can especially see that in the structure at Malafrea, which I didn't go into here, but. So this is a picture of it actually, and in the Roman period, it sees the addition of these rooms over here. There's a hearth in this one, in the middle, so a fire. So you could really not very good with non-math. Yeah. So in the plan of this structure in Roman times, you could say that it's kind of resembling a typical house. That's, I think, most of the evidence that we can connect to the structures in terms of living. There's been the suggestion that there were slaves in the towers, which in some cases there is evidence for it, potential evidence for it in terms of doors that lock in certain directions, but I didn't really find any of that. And I think if anyone can tell me how people lived in fortified farms, that would be amazing.
Follow up with a very similar question. Another person says, I'm intrigued by the similarities between the pre-imperial fortified farms and the tifliks of the Ottoman period, 18th, early 19th century. The tifliks were defined by outer walls and had central towers. Living quarters of the workers were organized around the courtyard.
That's an amazing question. Who asked that?
John Malcolm Baxter.
Can we exchange an email or something like that?
Just quickly repeat the question.
Yeah. So the question was that there's a similarity between the design with central towers of fortified structures and the tifliks of the early Ottoman period. Do you say?
Of the Ottoman period. Mainly 18th to early 19th century.
Yeah, it's something that I looked into very, very little, but just mainly something that I saw being in Epirus and seeing these different structures. I was also really struck by this. And it might be that this kind of plan, this kind of organization better reflects this landscape and the way that people have lived in it, or at least big pastoral families. And it might be that the same is true for Macedonia, which is why we have similarities in the plans. So yeah, that's all I can say. But
I'll put you in touch.
thank you.
Alex.
Thanks for that, Nicole. That was really interesting. I have a question about the diachronic aspect of this. I was very interested in the Roman period renovations of earlier structures, but is this continuous occupation from whatever Greek period we're in into Roman times? And then does it continue for quite a while through the Roman period into late Roman times or even Byzantine period?
For the fortified farms, you're asking, yeah.
In general, these types of sites that you're
Well, they actually we can't know 100% because of the nature of the evidence. So because they haven't been systematically excavated, I'm basically approaching the material from fortified farms, specifically the ones that I showed, as if it's survey data. So the concentration of the data that I saw was in the early Imperial, early Roman period more broadly, and a little bit also to the later Middle and later Imperial periods. So like second half of the 2nd century, 3rd century. It's not clear if they were continuously inhabited throughout that time period. Those are the provisional date ranges that I was talking about. And I think this is a much wider problem in terms of rural site data coming from excavated sites. But yeah, in terms of changes, what is interesting is that you can see that villas become increasingly popular throughout the Roman period. So there's definitely a change more towards villas, less villages and fortified farms, but it doesn't mean that they go away completely.
But the subject of workers, villas use the seasonal workers normally. So they didn't need to have workers all time inside. In some villas, not in Epirus, we found small houses for workers, but not inside the villa, next by the villa. So they needed a small staff of workers, and for the crops they use seasonal workers normally. About the use of the villa after the Roman period, it's all the villas and the majority of the cities didn't exist after the 6th, 7th century. In the Middle Ages, the system of villas was valid till the 5th century, 5th, 6th century. And then there is no villas because there is another system.
Yeah.
It's nothing. It's not possible to compare villas, Roman villas, with Chiflik and the systems of other periods.
Oh yeah. I think the issue with the Chiflik is more with the fortified farms, just in terms of the plan and but yeah, sadly they go out of use. What can I say?
Would you have us all living in villas still?
Would you not? Well, actually, no, definitely not. Yeah.
Are there any other online questions?
Yes, there are couples. Is it too great a simplification to posit that villas developed following the Roman conquest in a more peaceful environment than in the preceding periods?
I wonder if I should give that question to Rebecca. No, I mean, it's true that in the Roman period, there would probably have been far less warfare going on internally. Therefore, maybe less of a need for defenses. But people want to loot places all the time. I think that's kind of like a general accepted thing that might happen, especially in antiquity. And fortified farms don't go out of use. So it is a little bit simple, I think, to think about it in that sense. But yes, it does become a little bit more peaceful, maybe you can say. Yeah.
Any other questions from the audience? You have one more online. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be great to know who these are from, actually. Oh, I didn't say what the question was for the online audience. We go back to
you could summarize it very quickly.
Was it more peaceful in the Roman period than in the Hellenistic period? And is that why villas, can we posit that villas then emerged in Roman times, reflecting that?
They say, you mentioned the site of Dobra in coastal Caonia, where there is a so-called fortified villa, but also some evidence related to a sanctuary. Do you have any thoughts about possible links between them?
No.
You want to allude?
Oh yes. I spoke about a fortified structure at Dobra in coastal Caonia. There is very good evidence for a sanctuary near it, which has been studied, especially recently, by Milena Melfi at Oxford. And by Brian Martins for the sculptures. Do I have any thoughts on the relationship between the two? Not really. This is one of the sites that has been the least investigated out of all of the fortified structures in coastal Caonia. So the two are very close to each other. So basically, the villa, the fortified structure, is right on the top of a hill, and about maybe 10 meters or even less, I think. Next to it are the remains of a sanctuary where have been found monumental sculptures which are attributed to Damophon of Messini. Yeah, how the two are connected, I can't say, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, I think we've asked you quite a few questions, and maybe it's time to give you a drink. Might that be?
Sounds great.
We'd love to invite everybody for a drink in the Saloni next door. But before you go, let me do a couple of things. I'd like to thank Nefeli very much again for that fabulous talk. Also to give you a hint as to some of our upcoming events, and the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that we're doing our seminars in chronological order, starting from the Roman period and going back to pre-interesting. And the next seminar will be Carlotta, who will be speaking on the 6th of March. And in between them, we will have the VSA. What's the title of your short, Carlotta? Oh my God! Reading.
Revisiting ancient ceramic structures in the local economies, a landscape approach to Corinth and Sicily. Something along those lines.
That sounds great. And so do feel you're very welcome to come to Carlotta's talk. And the other thing, that dog is just completely terrible. Always calm in this house. The children will be beaten later on, I'm sure. what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, yes. And next week we have, what do we have? We have the open meeting with the work of the school. So should you be in Thessaloniki on Valentine's Day, who wouldn't want to be in Thessaloniki on Valentine's Day? While we give the work of the school, who wouldn't want to spend their Valentine's evening hearing about the work of the BSA in Thessaloniki? That's where we'll be. And then on the 16th, we'll be coming back to Athens. So if you come to Thessaloniki, you should also come to Athens, because it will be fabulous to hear it twice. And then the following week, we'll be in London. So, an option of 3 places to come and hear the work of the school.
Is that not virtual in London? No?
The London one is, sorry, yes, good point.
Mm.
So you can actually tune into the London one as well. But the most exciting part of those talks are going to be, we have Andrew Shapland in the Greek, in Athens, and Thessaloniki, talking about the exhibition in the Ashmolean, and I can't remember the title of the talk. Finding the Minotaur. I'm looking at your boss who's actually finding the title, Finding the Minotaur. And then Catherine Harlow will be speaking in London on the 20th. And that's all available online as well. So do feel free to come and join us either live or online for the London talk. And thank you again, Nefeli. Have a glass of wine, everybody. And thank you all very much for coming.